Welcome back from lunch. This is the panel on identifying the significances and work-defining properties from an artist point of view, but also from our point of view as conservators and collection caretakers. Before we get started, I'm just briefly introducing Siebren Versteeg, who's the artist of the Guggenheim case study. Siebren earned a BFA from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and an MFA from the University of Illinois at Chicago. He was a participant of the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture, a part-time instructor at Brooklyn College, and the 2009 Kennedy Family Artist in Residence at the University of South Florida. In the favor of time, I'm not going to read the many exhibitions that you've had, and then Jürg. Jürg Lehni works collaboratively across disciplines, dealing with the nuances of technology, tools, and the human condition. His works often take the form of platforms and scenarios for production, such as the drawing machines Hector, Rita, and Victor that we learned about earlier, as well as software-based structures and frameworks, including Paper.js, Scriptographer, and Vectorama.org. And Lehni as well has many exhibitions, but I have to skip it, I'm sorry. So, I would like to start with looking at the way that we've demonstrated in case study 1 and 2 how to capture what we feel are significant behaviors, and SF MoMA and Guggenheim have demonstrated two different but complementary approaches. SF MoMA has been working closely with the artist to capture those significances, and we have been basically looking at the code. The difference, of course, being that Victor was in the process of being acquired versus our piece by you has been more or less dormant since acquisition, and we've only revisited it now. So I would love to hear from both artists what you feel are the significances in your artwork and what it is that matters about your work and that you would like to see preserved by the collections that own your two artworks. And I would like to specifically talk about Untitled Film 2 and Victor.
Do you want to go first?
Whoever wants to go first.
Do you?
No.
No? Are you sure?
I have the mic.
I have the mic. What's significant, or what? What should be preserved, right? No.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. No, I just sorry. I thought my question wasn't.
What should be preserved? No, I mean, I think we've gone over it pretty well in the presentation before lunch. I think the piece, quite simply, involves what is meant to be an artificial yet cinematic experience, and ideally, it's placing the viewer in the space of life, in the space of the living. I made it in response to my own increasing immersion into screen space, and feeling like that was something that I wanted to communicate. So the original version of the piece situates the viewer in between two projections, so sort of in a sandwich between birth and death, quite simply. And at the time that I made that piece, I was really invested in this sort of idea of real time, which was a real kind of buzzword of the early millennial years. That said, obviously it's come up with many problems. It's funny because when I decided to make the piece, it was like one of these kind of pitch pieces where you're like, oh, it's going to be this. It's going to be real-time obituaries and real-time birth feeds, and I hadn't even really immersed myself or been interested in following that data online or knowing that it was there. And it was actually a lot harder to find than I thought it might be, and harder to scrape that data. But ideally, the piece preserves this cinematic space, and I think it would be as close to the documentation that you can get, and the birth announcements and death announcements would be happening right now. Does that make sense? So we did this little update, right, because I couldn't find any more real-time birth announcements happening online. So the best thing that I could find, or the closest to that seemed to exist today in today's online databases, was most popular names of a particular year. So that, in a way, is still kind of a live database. It's just that it's only updated once a year rather than daily or hourly. So this notion of real-time sort of stuff comes into question as well, and I think is always a pretty open-ended one.
Yeah, I think in the case of Victor, I think the most important aspects are the ones you see, so and hear. So I think it's the velocities at which it moves, the sound it makes, the acceleration, etc. And the funny part is that a lot of that I don't know as I'm building this device. I only see it once it's finished, and I can finally give it behavior through software. And I call that the Frankenstein moment, because you're like scheming this thing for months, and then eventually it starts moving. But then once it does move, it gains its character from that. And so if something would have had to be changed, I think it would be quite important that, for example, it would have the same velocity, but also the motors should sound kind of similarly. But I'm aware that there's huge differences in these products, and in a way, you only know until you build it, in that case too. So I don't know. At the same time, I would embrace changes there also. It would just mean a shift in its character. So I don't know if that makes sense. And in terms of software, I don't really care. I have a way of making my software, and I'm quite specific about it. But if a change in the hardware requires a change in the software, and I'm not the one doing it, I'm happy with that being different. But as long as the concern is to kind of make it similar to what it used to be. Oh, on your mic back. Okay.
How significant is the programming language and the back end? What is going on under the hood of the work? Is that part of the identity of the piece, and does that carry significance? You should both have one.
Yeah.
There we are.
Okay. Well. Yeah, I can do the ping pong. I think. It is important in a way that as you build what you're making, you're obviously influenced by whatever language you're using and the mindset that goes with it. So kind of a way of thinking about structure or etc. But I think once the piece is finished and things have to be replaced, they don't necessarily need to be in the same language, because it's not. I don't think that's the public-facing part of the work. So I wouldn't go as far as say like my source code is art, although I do have quite strong aesthetic concerns when I write code, but it's just because I can't not do it. But I wouldn't say like it has to be, the spirit has to be preserved, or the language. Or,
Yeah, same.
Okay.
Like exactly the same. Code is just a way of instructing the hardware to behave in a certain way, and whichever syntax is used to do that, I don't think it's significant.
But it is as you're building it, right? In your, yeah.
That is very interesting for me as a conservator. When we worked on your piece as a case study, we had you come to the lab and we conducted an interview, and the students were confronting you a little bit. They were like, why are you using this obsolete language, and why are you using it still? You said that you still code in Lingo. Lingo is one of your, you call it your native programming language, something that you grew up in and evolved in, and that many of your works are coded in. And to me as a conservator with my mindset, that is a significance, because it's to me the equivalent of artistic technique that is employed by a painter who chooses to only work in gouache also, because that's the way that he works. And for you it's Lingo, and you made very deliberate choices to work in open source. So I'm wondering if that is a significance that tells us as scholars of technical art history and the receiving end of your art, that tells us something about your artist practice. Don't you, how do you feel about that? I mean, obviously we're seeming to have like two different parameters for assessing significance.
Yeah. I mean, I used to feel like the the question of open source was one that surrounded my work a lot more than it does now. Maybe it was just earlier years of software art and a lot of certain kind of movements evolving out of that, you know? And I think that there were a lot of people who were sort of working interdisciplinary between art and code engineering. And I think that a lot of the open source kind of philosophy evolved from that kind of interaction. And I always appreciated it, and I definitely got a lot out of forums in terms of when I was learning code, but at a certain point, I feel like I just kind of drifted off in my own boat and had developed my own libraries and my own kind of methodology of constructing what I wanted the end user experience to be, which was for me primarily an artistic one. As far as the audience is concerned. And so I never really saw the need to document or open source a lot of the code that I did because I never thought it had any other, it couldn't really be used. Like I didn't feel like I was making tools for others to acquire, you know, except for the tools or the knowledge that they may acquire by experiencing the end work itself.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you don't have any reservations towards the proposal to migrate your piece if we can't support the director macromedia environment anymore.
Nope.
All right.
But at the same time, like I've also like I've never hesitated on any level to share my code too. You know, if the interest is there, which honestly it hasn't ever really been. Mm-hmm. And in fact, these the students are the first people to ever really comb through my code in my life, and that's been really interesting to learn about and see myself through the filtration of their experience of that, you know.
Siebren, sorry, before we continue with the significance of open source, I just would like to know how was that experience for you when the ladies went through your through your code and confronted you?
It's yeah, you know. I mean, I just kept looking at because I saw a few examples of my code in some of the PowerPoints. And I was like, "Oh, what did I call those variables? And what does that say?" You know, because when you're working, you're just working really spur of the moment. So I'm sure you're, saying things you're not intending to. You know, it's just like a Jasper Johns kind of statement or something.
Was there a moment of uncomfort?
Well, I don't know. Why? Is there something I should be uncomfortable?
No, I'm just asking.
No.
Okay.
No, not really. No.
Okay. What about your choice of using open source software and even open source hardware, as Martina showed us? What significance does that have? You told us earlier that you are part of a community that tries to be, part of that open source movement.
Yeah, I mean, a part of my interest is in open source platforms, and it has to do with me also teaching programming to creative people. And so I started building my own platforms quite early on when I was still studying. The Scriptographer was started in 2001, and there was no processing yet. So it was kind of my own urge, and in a slightly different field, to create my own tools. And there it was actually about confrontation of a closed source platform, which is Adobe Illustrator. And I wanted to add a scripting environment to it so I could make my own tools, but still using it for printmaking. And in a way, that's where it all started. It's also the reason why I started making printmaking machines as a next step, or mark-making machines. And so there's always this interest in open source has always been there. And in a way, I mean, I learned the culture through that. And in a way now, I mean, I would probably just choose whatever works for the job. I wouldn't really make a hierarchy between open source or closed source necessarily. But I think now, given the acquisitions that happened, I mean, on one side, Victor for the SF MoMA, but then also this new commission at the Long Now Foundation, and those two projects sort of merging, I knew that I had to build in a way that would, with longevity in mind, and this was the first time. I never thought about these things before. And I knew from the Adobe and Scriptographer experience that corporate lock-in is very dangerous, and I got really tired of Adobe. And every time I give a conference, I end up bashing Adobe. So no offense if any of you work there, but I don't like Adobe. Let's get it out there. Anyway, no, so I was aware of that, and so I had to try and avoid that as much as I could. But then with Victor, the way it's built is, I don't know, there's the requirements for the motors and the timing and the fact that the motion needs to be extremely synchronized, and also the strength that these motors actually need. I haven't found anything yet in open source that does what I wanted to do. So even in this redevelopment last year, I ended up working with this company in Switzerland, which is doing these industrial motors used often in robotics, but also, as Martina said, on the Pathfinder in Mars. So they're like at the other end of the spectrum. They're like super high end, not cheap, but they speak my mother tongue, so and I have good contacts to them, and I ended up working with their stuff. But that's something I'm also a bit worried about, because I feel like maybe 10 years from now, if I look where I stood 10 years ago, when I made, or 12 years ago, 13 years ago actually, when I made the first of these drawing devices called Hector, we ended up, with my friend Uli Franke, we ended up hand etching the circuit boards and programming the PIC in assembler. And I mean, Arduino didn't exist, and it was really hard to make. And then Arduino came, and things became way easier to make to a certain extent. But now we're here, and this is not the stop of that development, of course. Like, I think eventually you could probably make anything on an industrial level, but with open technology. And so I have a feeling that, maybe 10 years from now, I will engage in a new version that will be fully open source. And I don't know, that was a long answer now.
No, that's great.
But I feel like there's this weird kind of, it's almost like a force that just washes over everything. I mean, people call it disruptiveness or whatever you want to call it, and it has good and bad sides. Like, it's a democratization of the means. But at the same time, we were talking about this outside earlier on. The first machine that I built is called Hector, and it inspired people to make similar machines, and Arduino came along, and that became easy. And all of a sudden, I was facing all these versions of this principle that I felt strongly about, because I felt like I invented it. And I didn't invent it either. Later I found out that there were people in the 80s already toying with this idea in the context of academia and teaching with Logo, which is a nice context. But anyway, I mean, I think we all probably know this as creatives, the disruptive potential of technology, and that's something that was once hard to make becomes really easy through a new development, but it has a good side and a bad side. I mean, it's just it's a reality, but it's also an opportunity in terms of conservation, I think. Mm-hmm. That's kind of what I wanted to say. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. You just mentioned longevity,
mm-hmm.
and that one of the reasons for you to choose open source is to prevent rapid obsolescence, or at
mm-hmm.
least it's fixable, if you like, and not dictated by external companies. How much support do software-based artists need from collecting institutions to maintain their artworks? In other words, all the effort that Martina and her team have put into getting your work into the collection, getting the repository up, getting the documentation in place, that's a huge effort on the side of the collector. How much of that do you need in order to be comfortable and say, okay, these works are going to live on? Maybe Siebren can answer that, because we didn't do a fantastic job in checking it in at the time. We're trying to do that now. But
yeah, I mean, for me, I mean, Martina really used the word, which is relationship, and acquiring a piece of work that requires, an infrastructure that is dependent on others or technology, I think requires, updates and maintenance. And so I think as long as we're around, I see every acquisition of my work to be like, oh, I have a new relationship now. And that's a responsibility that I take on. And sometimes to the gallery's dismay, because I often am in contact with my collectors more than they are, So it's kind of an interesting, give and take that happens, you know? I mean, yes, the weight of having more and more works out there in the world and collections certainly burdens my studio practice, you know? But it's maybe also influencing my studio practice to do other things or be efficient in other ways, you know? So, but I see it as a relationship. And when I first started making this work, and that's one of the reasons why I triangulate, for example, the birth and death feeds, which go through a filter on my server. That was my sort of first attempt at putting a maintenance stipulation into the work, so that should the legacy.com obituary pages change their URL or change the way that they deliver these names, you know, now with no hyphens, or now, you know, behind a different HTML tag, which is the stuff you use to scrape through and extract this data, which I think is ultimately kind of illegal anyway. I had a way to change that, you know, and still have the piece work flawlessly. I could do these repairs behind the scenes, and no one on the viewer player end needed to know.
You just mentioned one important word, responsibility. It seems like in the relationships that you engage in, based on the fact that the collectors or museums either don't want to or can't take full responsibility of the preservation of your works. And I think I would like to ask Martina how SF MoMA feels about it, since you are, in your case study, you demonstrated an exceptional approach to collecting this kind of work, where you do give a lot of responsibility to the artist to you know, help keeping the documentation up to date and to commit his changes, etc. How do you deal with the lack of control that comes with outsourcing the responsibility?
I guess we're okay with that, obviously. And as I said earlier, it is, this relationship goes both ways. And we do, I mean, working with Jürg was so incredible. And to your earlier question, what does the collection do to support this? We actually learned an incredible amount working with Jürg, and he has given us so much input, because we are a contemporary art museum. We are not experts in software-based, you know, environments. We have art backgrounds. So we were actually looking at him for guidance on how to deal with that. And of course, we were working with Mark as an external expert. But I think, yeah, we were sort of here, and we said, we're in for this, but we don't know what to do. Like when this question came up, can we acquire this? When I said, in this moment, we had no answer for that. I mean, we said yes, and we were in for this, but we didn't know what we were in for, actually. And
who came up with the idea to have a Git repository, a shared Git repository, or version control repository?
Well, Jürg, actually. I mean, this whole Git thing has been like, you know, flowing around us all the time. Like it's out there, and we know about it, and we hear about it. But then it got really concrete with this work of art, and Jürg was sort of like the force behind that. And I would say.
And Jürg, how do you feel about that? How do you feel about that responsibility? Like, can you imagine there's a point in the future where you would just like to hand off the responsibility and not be the one updating your documentation, etc.?
Well, I mean, eventually it's documented.
Pardon?
Eventually it is documented, so then you don't have to add to it, right? I mean, yeah, no, I'm really excited about it, because in a way, when I made these things, I never thought about that step. And then at one point I realized all these things I'm making, they're not very sellable, and they're not very collectible because they're kind of complicated. And I'm really glad and thankful that there's an institution who's maybe crazy enough to do this, and or brave enough, Yeah, I don't know. I think it's a journey. Like I don't know what to expect, and we'll just find out as we go along. But and I proposed the methods that I normally would use in my own work or when I work in teams. Those are the tools I know, and I know they work. So I just proposed those, and it seems to work well in this context too. So, but it's an experiment.
And I love that you said it's a journey, because I think that's what it is. And this work has now just entered a collection, and it's a different sort of stage in the life of this work, and it's still not the end. And I think that's also what I try to convey in my talk, is that we're sort of to go that journey together with the artist in the future, and I think that's
honeymoon.
that's what we committed to do, right. And we know it is a commitment, but we also need to get to know the work as an institution, and we and so what I forgot to mention in my talk is, so in 2016, when we're in our new building, Victor will go on view, and we've already scheduled a residency for Jürg to come and be part again of this installation, and we will furthermore sort of deepen our understanding for the work and how to install it, and by sort of moving alongside like this and sort of growing with or seeing the work grow over time, this will also make our understanding so much deeper for the work, and so that we can make way more informed decisions when future preservation questions come up. But as of now, I feel like the work is still in flux, and it's not ended yet. And we will also, with that, we will update our documentation and then spread this knowledge also like within our institution. I also wanted to bring that up, that it's not just me working with Jürg, it's like there's a whole team around us. It's really the whole institution working.
Last question to SF MoMA before I open it up to the floor and you get to ask questions to all of our speakers as well. Are you going to implement shared Git repositories for other software-based works in your collection now as well? Now that you've like gone through this whole experiment and you're learning from this, do you think you're going to do this for the other works?
I think it's really exciting to have that and to share this with the artist. I think it's also sending like a really nice statement to the artist, and I think what we want to implement in any case is a Git repository that is linked to our server, where even other works of art that we have that are software-based have that in a tracked repository. So that's what we're going to do for sure. If we do these like shared, I think we're not like, also in this case, we're not saying, oh, and now we're doing shared, because that's what we do. I think it's a case-by-case decision, and if the artist is down for doing that, I think we're also in for that.
Okay, I would like to open up the, I would like to open up the floor. We started a little late, so I would like to go over just a few minutes, and please, if you have questions or you want to share your own stories, come to the front and engage with the presenters of both case studies.
So it's so great to be able to access the actual artist and ask questions, particularly about the future of the piece. So I think our industry needs to figure out what's ethical in changing pieces when the artist isn't around to answer those questions. But in particular, we do code analysis and we find embedded viruses, or we find openings for hackers to come in and take over the art, particularly internet-connected art. Do we have a responsibility to fix those holes if we can't get a hold of the artist? Is that, or to just shut it down and say, well, that was performance art and that's the end of it? What do we do with that situation? When can we change the art without approval?
That's something for whoever wants to do that.
I don't know. Who wants to hack an artwork?
Can you go to the mic? We can't hear you otherwise.
So I don't think that's actually a problem, because it's perfectly possible to set up a DMZ that neutralizes any attacks that are coming in. So, you know, I'm just... Well, you hope. Yeah, sure. I mean, you want it fully decoupled and stuck behind the DMZ, but it's not, I gotta say, it's not that hard.
But this is true for any smart home device, right?
I mean, I can say just from a little bit of experience that I've had works hacked, just like you're describing, where they were internet connected and somebody found a hole in it or whatever and started broadcasting porn into the gallery or something. And yeah. Wasn't me. No, and but I've always taken it on a case-by-case basis, and if the exhibiting or collecting institution was thoughtful enough to ask me those questions, then usually we lay out some guidelines. And oftentimes, there's been an IT department involved, and can they put virus protection on it? Well, yeah, and or will I? And I don't like to mess around with any of that stuff, so I say, no, I won't, but if you do, make sure there's no pop-ups, things like that, or reminders and nagware, interrupting the work. But I think, again, it's a relationship and a conversation. So the answer is probably, but as long as we're around, I guess, talk to us and maybe document those interactions, so then maybe you can maintain the zeitgeist in the future when we're not around, I'm
closer. I can do first. Thanks very much for great presentations, all of you. I'm really curious, Martina, on the SF MoMA case. In this, you talk about it kind of changes the organization of the museum as well. It seems how you work together. Could you elaborate a bit on that, and also in particularly how you use this now as a case study, and how are you going to standardize this in the future?
Standardize our ways of working?
Yeah.
So or let me start like this. Chill Stare was really pioneering this way of working and bringing experts to the table from throughout the museum, and it started out with media conservation in times where there were no media conservators, there were no guidelines, that there were no structures in place yet. So that's how this team media was sort of founded. And what we saw was that by bringing all these people to the table, everybody was on the same page. The right hand knew what the left hand was doing, and it made working together so much easier and so much more smooth. And we see that when we have acquisitions like that, or media software-based artworks with other departments where we don't have these working relationships even within our institution in place, that things aren't as smooth, and we run into problems or issues that we don't, where we have these reoccurring meetings and also relationships within our institution, and this has been really great. Is that or?
Yeah, and I'm curious indeed if you think of ways on how to standardize the methods that you do now. Like with the work that you've just presented now, the case study, are you thinking also of how to proceed that in the future when perhaps artists are not around, or not as willing as to give you all the information? So how do you sort of standardize these workflows? Maybe a bit early to ask already, but.
I think we try to enforce them or follow them, or just work like that as often as we can. And I think it is also it depends a lot on the artist himself. If Jürg was not as engaged as he is and as enthusiastic, then we would probably not have these intense, this very intense time. But I think we try to foster it, and we have activities within our institution. We have study days at our collection center where we bring people together. We have most lately we started, it's called Review and Refresh, and it's a series where we again bring people together and we talk about media conservation throughout everyone that is working at the collection center. That is from installation to registration, everybody's involved. And so I think it's fostering a culture from within our institution. And we've also launched several research projects, and I'm looking at Robin Clark behind you, who's like the director of the Artist Initiative. That is, again, another project of putting the artists in the center, bringing the artists back to the museum, and fostering these collaborations within our institutions and confirming this way of working.
In my experience developing and working with other people's code, I've often found cases where bugs form part of kind of a relationship with the users, and it becomes a desired piece of functionality or a quirk that's kind of expected to be there. If something were found like that in your code, how would you want that to be handled? Would you want it documented and then fixed, or would that be preserved in newer versions of the code for the viewers and the experience?
Can you ask it again? Sorry, what?
Sorry, I wasn't close enough to the mic. Okay, so bugs sometimes help enforce the character of the code. So if there's a quirk in the code and people see that and kind of expect it to be there, and if someone were to go back and fix that, would you be upset that it lost some of the character, or would you want to just document that and move forward?
I mean, if it affects the character, then maybe yes, be upset. But if just stupid coding that could be more efficient, I'd appreciate it.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree. But I guess as a piece is acquired, you kind of define what the character is of it. If the quirk is part of it, then that would be known, I think, right? I mean,
would that be an important part of the history for you, or would that be an important part of the history, or something you'd rather forget, I guess?
I don't know if there's anything that I truly desire to forget, you know? Like I see, like I'm looking to accumulate information rather than forget it in general. So, I mean, I do forget, but I'm never really psyched about it, you know?
I think that was a great closing statement. All right. I'm afraid we have to cut it off here. We're going to be listening to more case studies now. Thank you so much to Siebren and Jürg for coming and to the case study presenter.